Hi everyone, I'm hoping that you can see my screen there. So yeah, hi everyone. My name's Dan. I'm a paediatric ST4. I started at Queen's and spent 6 months there, and then I've moved to Whips Cross. I'm going to be there for the next 18 months. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about leading at night. We might cover some of the things that Ria's already talked about or that's going to be talked about later on, but it's good to still just reiterate the same things. Let's see. So this is the plan for today. So we're going to talk a little bit about night shift fears, some of the things that I was particularly worried about before starting night shifts, and some of the things that you might also be worried about too. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to plan your night shift, a bit about how to lead your team now that you're going to be leaders in ST4, things about managing resources, things like beds and staff and sickness, and calling for help, who to call and when to call, and then just a couple of tips for survival as well. So this is pretty much what I was thinking when I started at Queen's, because I looked at the rota and realized that after sort of 2 days on the ward, I was going to be starting on nights. So one of my first worries was I'm not going to know where anything is or how anything works. How am I going to figure that out? What if I can't get the line in, which we sort of talked about a little bit before? What if I don't know what the best management is? So I was fortunate enough to have done Gen Peds at the end of ST3 at the Whittington, so I was kind of coming fresh off that. But for a lot of people that might be coming off tertiary neonates or coming off a specialty, it's been a while since they've done their general pediatrics, and just how am I going to know what to do, and is that the right thing? What if there's a resus or a cardiac arrest? How's that going to go? Have I led one before? Have I been in a pediatric cardiac arrest before? And what happens if there's more than one emergency at the same time, and there's just a little on me trying to figure my way through it? And should I wake the boss up for this? Am I going to get sort of told off? Is this something that I actually need to wake them up for? So first of all, just how to go about planning your shift. So the most important thing is to figure out who your team are. That's both numbers wise and who they actually are. So think about the competency of your juniors. So your juniors can range, like Ria said, from anything from an F1 or F2 up to your GP trainees or your pediatric STs. And it's just really good at the beginning of your shift to figure out exactly how much pediatric experience people have and just how comfortable they are generally in pediatrics. I think a lot of your juniors, like F1s and F2, will tell you that they've never done any peds before and they're really stressed about it, and that's totally fine. The more you know, the better you'll be able to support them. Find out how many regs there are on the shift. So like I said, like Ria said, at Queen's there's a couple of you on nights. There's 3 of you at Queen's, and at Whips Cross there's actually 2 of you. Think about your staff numbers and which clinical areas you're actually supposed to be covering. So for at Whips Cross for A&E, the reg is covering just A&E, and the other registrar is covering the ward and the SCABU. And then find out sort of where your SHOs are supposed to be and how they're split up. Find out who your consultant on call is. It's really important to find that out early, I think, especially as you get to be comfortable in a department and know sort of which consultants might want a phone call a little bit earlier, or which consultants maybe are less keen on getting called, sort of, and you maybe not want to call them for the most trivial minor things. Find out who your nursing charge is and who your nursing team are. They will honestly carry you through your first ST4 year. But definitely my first 6 months at Queen's, the ED nurses were my saving grace, and finding out who the nurse in charge are, how many nurses you've got, if the team's well staffed, if they're short staffed, if they're all equally stressed is really good. Finding out if you have something called a clinical site practitioner or a CSP. So Queen's have got these, your trust might have them, Whips Cross don't. They're usually band 7 senior nurses that most of them have sort of PICU experience under their belt, and they'll be great at helping you support, especially when it's really sick children. They can do sort of like an ATE assessment whilst you're managing them as well, and they're good to sort of bounce ideas off as well. It's a bit like having another registrar around. And then also find out sort of what the anaesthetic setup is, like how many anaesthetic registrars there are in your hospital, who you're going to be able to go to for support, and things like your transfer teams. So if you're working in a trust or in an area that you've worked in before, you might know who it is, if it's CATS or STRS or someone else. But it might be, you might be working in a deanery that you've never worked in before, and so it's good to just find out exactly how you get in contact with them, how the systems work, knowing that, for example, CATs are the ones that will transfer cardiac babies as opposed to NTS. Then onto prioritizing your tasks early. So you'll get handed over, it's your shift now, you run the show, and you've got to figure out what's the most important thing to do. Where am I needed? Where do I need to allocate juniors to? So most important thing, sick patients first. So whether you're on the ward or in ED, you need to get an idea from the registrar that's handing over to you, or also from the nurse in charge. Who are they worried about? Who's sick? Who needs my attention first of all? Everything else can kind of wait after that. Nurse in charge is also a great person to go to for this. Sometimes the day team may not be the most up to date on recent deteriorations or concerns of the nurses. It's good to touch base with them to find out if they're worried about anyone in particular. And also, if you're covering SCBU or NICU or labour ward, speaking to the ward midwife in charge is a great idea, especially if you've got some sneaky preterm babies hanging around that might be delivered on your shift. It's good to know about them early, especially if they are if you're working in a level 2 and they're under a certain gestation. You want to know about that, so you can let your consultant know. Then think about time sensitive tasks, so things that are very much going to impact on your decision making. Whether that's results of certain blood tests, or if patients have, for example, been given burst therapy and you know that they're due a review soon or they're due to be stretched, you need to prioritize that stuff early, because even though it might be there might be one patient you're really worried about, you do need to be aware of those time sensitive things, because the longer you leave them, they'll lead to more work later on if you missed stretching someone or somebody deteriorates because you didn't think about the fact that they'd got burst, etc., etc. Something I like to think about is time to decision. So if you get handed over a patient and you think to yourself, okay, I don't really know what's going on with them. For some of them, you know that there are certain things that are going to have to be done before you can actually end up making a decision about that patient. One particular thing I can think about is if you get handed over a patient with, for example, a non-blanching rash in an otherwise well child, most of the time you know that they're going to need blood tests regardless. There might be lots of other patients waiting to be seen, but you know that you've got that probably 2 hours between taking the bloods and getting the results back, and you can identify that kid's going to need bloods at some point. So you can actually, in Queen's and at Whipps Cross, you can get some of those bloods done early, and then you can then review them after that, or get one of your SHOs to review them after that. And then thinking about the ED board, so pretty much you want to put things in time order and go down in terms of who's been waiting longest in the department. But then you need to think about any flagged patients from the day registrar or from the nurses, and ideally prioritizing those that are under 3 months old as well. Obviously, if they have a fever and they're under 3 months, they're going to jump most likely to the top of your priority list. But also under 3 months olds, you really don't want them to be hanging around in the department for too long. And some of them are very, very quick turnarounds if they're coming for things like constipation or things that it's just new parents being concerned. You can get them quickly reviewed, get them out, and then move on. Try to think ahead. I know it's easier to say that, but try and anticipate some of the issues that you might come along with some of the patients, depending on what they're presenting with, and try and plan, not just if you're doing blood tests or if you're doing investigation. Don't just make a plan based on what you think the result might be. Make multiple plans based on, if it's this, then I'm going to do this. If it's not this, then I'm going to do this, and communicate that with your nurses as well, because then it will really help them figure out the flow of the department and where people are going to be going. Then plan your breaks. So it's really easy to just crack on. I know that when I started at Queen's, I came into my first night shift, and there was almost 50 kids in the department. It was about a 6.5 hour wait to see an ED doctor. And I just started working from the get-go, and it's really easy before you know it for 5-6 hours to go past and you just haven't taken a break. And you need to think about your juniors as well and the rest of your team. No one needs an exhausted doctor. There's no point in you just continuously seeing patient after patient. You're going to be tired. The patients aren't going to get the best from you. So make sure you take a break. Ideally, take a break with your team, because it's just good for team building. It's good for morale. You can touch base with people, see how they're doing, and really just plan the rest of your shift. That's not always possible. Sometimes it can be really, really busy and you just can't afford to leave the department. So try and stagger your breaks then. So send some of your juniors off, half your team or some of your team off, come back in half an hour, and then yourself and someone else can go off as well. And you can always stay near to the department, but at least you get some time physically off the shop floor. And believe it or not, there is always time for a break. It might not feel like that, but even 5 minutes, most patients can wait. It might feel like, oh, they've been waiting for forever, but 5 minutes, a cup of tea, and just a second to yourself will be very, very helpful. Think about accessibility. So making sure that the bleeps work, that your phones work, that people are able to contact you. If you identify any problems at the beginning of your shift, fix those ASAP, because the longer you leave it, it might not seem like something that needs to be sorted out, but you're just one emergency away from sort of not being able to contact your colleagues, or your colleagues not being able to get to you, and you're kind of in a bit of trouble there. So just make sure that all that stuff is working. Obviously swap numbers with who's with you on the night team. Make a WhatsApp group. That's always helpful. It's nicer to just sort of remind people of things, or if you don't necessarily have to give them a call, you can, or if they're up on the ward, for example, you can just send them a message to check that in a drug chart or to change this. And then prepare for handover. So I like to think of it as a team activity. It's a nice way of just sort of rounding off the shift, making sure that you catch up with everyone and make sure that nothing's been missed. Sometimes it often does fall to the SHO to prep the list, and that's fine, but I think it's also good for you to have some input into it. It's a good opportunity to review observations for kids on the ward, touch base with the nurse in charge, make sure there's nothing that's changed and that she's happy with all the patients, and chase any results for bloods and things like that you might have done earlier on in the shift. And now that you're a registrar, you're going to be thinking about sort of other things that maybe you hadn't thought about as an SHO. So consider the next shift. So think about time sensitive tasks. If you know that certain blood tests have to be done, antibiotic levels or things like that, you're going to have to prioritize those for the next shift, because they might be happening, for example, when you're in handover, in which case you might need to prioritize someone just popping out at the beginning to make sure that gets done. And things like staffing levels. So you might find out, for example, on the main WhatsApp group that someone is calling in sick at 6 o'clock in the morning, and that might have an impact on the way that the day shift's going to go. So you might want to think about trying to help the day team out with prepping as much work as you can towards the end of that shift, if it's possible, and if you're not absolutely knackered. Thinking about transfers, so patients that you've identified are going to be going out, not necessarily because they're sick, but because they have appointments at other hospitals and they might need transfer letters. So making sure that all that is sort of prepared. Ideally, it should be done the day before, but if it's not, it's good to at least identify that it needs to be done. And then prepping discharge letters, bit of a contentious issue for me. I think it's good to try and get them done, but also tired brains are not the best ones to be trying to prepare discharge letters. If you are going to try and do them, and if your juniors are happy to, try and prioritize the ones that are sort of simple, maybe viral induced wheeze discharge letters that you don't need to worry so much about being super detailed in. Moving on to leading your team. So think about what your minimum staffing levels are, so you'll have an idea of who you're supposed to have on your shift and who may or may not be there. So at Queen's, you've actually got quite a lot of people in the hospital. So you've got an ED reg, an ED SHO, a PAU reg, a PAU SHO, and your upstairs you've got your ward reg and your ward SHO. At Whips, you've got 4 of you on. So you've got your ED reg, your ward SHO, which will hopefully come and help you in ED on the night. And then you've got a ward reg that's also covering your NICU, and a NICU SHO that's covering the labour ward. If these people don't turn up for your shift, it's not your job to just sit there quietly and just figure it out. You need to make sure that people are aware of that, because if you're short-staffed, it impacts on safety and it impacts on the way the shift's going to go. You've got to inform your consultant early. They might not be aware of it, they might be aware of it, but you're not aware that they're aware of it. So you need to just touch base with them and make sure that they know. And also that they're aware that if things really go pear-shaped on the night shift, they're getting called, and they're getting called early because you just don't have enough doctors. Gauge your competencies early. So we mentioned this before, and Rhea mentioned this about just trying to get to know your team. And it's not always the easiest thing when you first start in a new hospital and you don't know anyone yet, but figuring out how comfortable someone is with peds and how much experience they have is going to be really, really important to the way that you manage the team. And just remember that training level doesn't always reflect your competency. So there might be GP trainees that have done pediatrics before. They may have left peds and they've done it before, or they might have had some peds experiences in the F2. So don't sort of count them off as being completely new to pediatrics if they are. And you might have ST3s that you assume to be sort of almost be registrars, but they might be returning to training. They might have been on an OOP, they might have been on research, they might have been on mat leave. So just take that into account and figure out how comfortable people are and how much support they're going to need from you. As Rhea said before as well, promote accessibility and communication. So the more you know about the department, the better. I think you just want to make sure that you're an approachable person, that the juniors can come to you, the nurses can come to you, and that you're constantly sort of catching up with people throughout the shift to find out if there's been any changes, where you're at with those patients. Have the DTAs, the ones that you've decided to admit, have they moved upstairs yet? What's your department looking like? Have you handed over, etc.? And like I said before, just ensure that the juniors feel comfortable. They need to know that there aren't any dumb questions. They might have worked in specialties, not to name any specific ones, but they might have worked in specialties where, you know, they don't feel that comfortable asking the registrar certain things. They're not sure if it's their job to ask the registrar that kind of thing. The more comfortable they are with you, the more information you're going to know and the better you're going to be able to support them. Right, managing resources. So this might not be something that most people have done as an SHO because it's usually not your job, but as a registrar, these are the kinds of things that you're going to have to start to think about now. Most importantly, beds. So it's very common at handover at 8:31, you get told, by the way, we've got no cubicles, we've got no beds, good luck, figure it out. So it's not a nice position to be in, but in winter, it's quite a common position to be in. So you need to think about how you're going to manage this. You need to liaise with your nurse in charge or your CSP and figure out, is she aware of sort of the bed status of other hospitals? Has anyone spoken to EBS, emergency bed service yet? What's the ward status upstairs? Can you move patients around? Is it that you have beds and but you don't have any cubicles? And are all the patients that are in cubicles, do they actually have to be in cubicles? And can you shift some things around upstairs to make some space? Again, it's really good to inform your consultant early, mostly because if you're going to be treating and transferring patients, they should be aware of it, and they need to understand what the situation is on the wards. And then think about who's appropriate for transfer in your emergency department. You're only going to want to be moving stable patients, and if none of your patients are stable, then none of your patients are going anywhere, and that's just the fact of the matter. I know it's easy as a new reg to kind of want to please everyone and make sure that you're doing the best that you can, but sometimes that's all you can do, and that's just making sure that everyone is safe and you can figure out how to move them and where to move them later on. The emergency bed service is helpful. They will identify sort of where beds are available, but they're not necessarily going to be helping out any more than that. So they'll be able to tell you there are 3 beds at the North Mid, or there are 2 beds at Homerton, and that's about it. And that information is not always up to date. And you've got to think about things like nurse staffing in those wards and how that may change. So the best thing to do is, if you identify a bed, see if you can get your nursing colleagues to give them a call. But if they can't, at some trust, it often falls on the paediatric registrar. It's not ideal. Your clinical work comes first, but if you have time, give them a call. It's best to go for the nurses first on that ward and find out if they're actually happy to accept a patient. There's no point in you speaking to a peds reg, usually who's busy in A&E. He'll say, I think so, but check with the nurses. Often the site managers can help out with these kinds of things, and it's variable depending on which trust you work at, who's going to be happy to help out. And think about PAU review versus admission. So you might get handed over a patient that you said, yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on, but I think they need an admission because I don't really know what's going on. And this might be an opportunity to say, let me re-review the patient, let me look at the history and figure out, actually, is this someone that's well, that I can bring back to a PAU for a consultant review tomorrow, if you have that kind of setup at your hospital, versus taking up a bed overnight, which you can use for another patient. Think about your staff. So again, this comes to managing your resources, managing your team. Think about who your anaesthetic team are. If you're struggling with a cannula, or if your juniors are struggling with a cannula and you're busy with something that's going to take time, and you know for sure that this child has had multiple cannulation attempts already, you might only have 1 or 2 shots left in terms of good veins, and you might want to think early about using your other resources like your anaesthetic team. Thinking about your ED team as well. So it's variable on some night shifts. ED might be particularly busy, peds might be not so busy. On other days, peds is incredibly busy and the ED team are actually managing okay. And if you're nice to them, they'll be nice to you on other shifts. So just think about trying to use them as a resource, and seeing if they can, you can work together as a team. Managing staff sickness. So as I said before, if somebody is calling in sick to your night shift, or someone has called in sick to the next day, you need to kind of think about how that's going to impact now on the flow of work and how many people you're going to have around in the daytime the next day. It's not necessarily your job in the acute setting, but it's good to be aware of and to make sure that the consultants in the daytime are aware of this early, so they can kind of move things around and figure out how things are going to work. just in terms of staff and your resources, just think about fatigue and about how maybe your staff are going to be feeling, including you, on your first shift versus your fourth night shift. Everyone's going to be a little bit more knackered. Just think about giving a bit more sort of give to those people. Finally, IT/software, the joys of NHS IT. Definitely at Whips Cross, there's always planned IT maintenance issues. Drives are always going down, or certain programs are not working overnight. Think about these things when it comes to prepping the list. So for example, we had a night shift a few nights ago where we didn't have access to the list for pretty much across the handover period. So you need to be thinking about maybe sending that list to your NHS email early so that you can access it another way. Figure out where your guidelines are, where both your trust and always your nice guidelines if you're needing help with not knowing what to do. And the apps, as Ria mentioned, particularly paediatric emergencies, which will come in very, very handy when you hear that a blue call is coming in. Calling for help. This was something that I think a lot of people, are worried about, both calling for help from other teams, from CATs, from consultants. So when it comes to anesthetics, it's always good to stick to an SBAR. Some of them are a bit more are comfortable managing pediatric patients. Some of them maybe less so, and it depends on kind of the anesthetic registrar and the trust. Just stick to the SBAR because you want to be clear about why you're calling. If you're worried about this child's airway, if you're worried about this child being very sick and potentially deteriorating, and you want an early anesthetic review because you're going to be calling CATs, get those conversations in and be clear about exactly what you want from that registrar. So CATs, or whichever team you're going to be calling, particularly for CATs in North London, the referral form is on their website. So that's quite nice to look at just before you make the phone call, because that's the pro forma that they're going to be using with you on the phone anyway. So you basically have all the questions there that they're going to ask you, so you can make sure you have everything ready, including OBS, drugs, etc., for them. And ideally inform your consultant first. If you've got a child that's sick and is deteriorating and probably needs retrieval, it's good to get in touch with the consultant early to let them know you're making that phone call. In a Hurry is a great section of the CAT's website as well. They've got their prescribing drug calculator on it for all the emergency drugs, and it's always good to print that out early with the child's weight on it and have those things ready, because some of these drugs take a while to prepare, and it's good for the nursing staff as well. Finally, calling your consultant for help. So the big question of, should I wake this person up for this? So if you are calling them, depending on the time of night, cut to the chase, be concise about exactly what you want from them. I think it's very easy to sort of waffle and try and qualify exactly why you're calling the consultant by explaining a lot of the background and the history. But really, if you want them to come in now, that's all you need to say. And then you can give them a one line as to why it is. And then they can come back to you with yes or no, or why, if they think that's appropriate. Stick to an SBAR, like we said before, same as anesthetics, and call them early. I think it's better to be calling a consultant early and actually then say, that's fine, do this, do that, call me back in an hour or two and let me know what's happening, rather than calling them too late when the child's deteriorating. That is the situation where I think the consultant's going to be quite annoyed that they hadn't been called earlier on. Sometimes it's 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Make sure you summarize the plan back to them. I think it's easy for somebody to make a plan, especially if you're not 100% sure about that plan and if it makes sense to you, or if you have questions about it. One way to kind of frame that question is just to summarize it back to them to say, okay, so just to check, this is this kid that's come with blah, 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 and your plan is you want me to do this, 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 and this. And then they can, say, yep, that's exactly what I want to do, or actually, no, wait, don't do that, do this. Document the conversation, ideally at the time of having it, just so that you have that sort of written in the notes that you call them at this time, and then this is what the advice was. Ideally call them through switchboard. People say this is for medico-legal reasons. I think it's good to try and call them through switchboard. It also gives them a couple of seconds to wake up when the switchboard calls them and tells them that they have a call for them. But I know that's not always the case. Some consultants prefer to be called on their mobile, and they might give you on their mobile, and that's also fine. But ideally, it's better to probably call through switch. And as Ria said, if you're not sure whether to call them, just call them. I've spent at least 10 minutes last week deliberating on whether or not I should wake someone up at 3 o'clock in the morning to scan some kids' heads. And I decided that after 10 minutes of thinking about it, the right thing to do was just to give them a call. So I gave them a call. Finally, some tips for survival. So these are going to be a lot more tiring than your SHO nights. So pace yourself. I think it's really easy at the beginning to just go and be like, I'm going to be the reg, I need to survive, I need to be the best. But you're still human. You need to kind of look after yourself and make sure that you're going to make it through these set of nights. So think about the fact that you will get more tired because you're going to be making lots and lots of decisions, and be aware of decision fatigue. So I don't think I've ever had to make as many decisions in my life as that first set of nights. Just 4 nights of constantly people coming up to you, asking you, what do we do about this? Or this has happened. What do we do now? And it's really easy towards the end of that to just feel like I'm tired. I can't make a decision right now. And that's fine. It's really important to think about self-care, taking a break, taking 5 minutes, having a cup of tea, and then coming back. And I think one of the things that I struggled or it took me a while to understand as a registrar is it's okay to not know. It's all right to just not have the answer, and you can say that. And I think it should be acceptable for you to say, I actually don't know what to do in this situation. I'm going to have a think about it. I'm going to do a quick Google and just remind myself of exactly what we do in this situation, and I'll come back to you. And with parents with differential diagnoses, I often say, I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I'm going to take 10 minutes, I'm going to have a little think about it, and then come back and let you know. And they're always like, fine, that's fine. Look after your team and they will look after you. So like Ria was saying, you're all in it together. The more that you support the SHOs, the more that they will definitely help you out when things are getting tiring for you as well. Touch base with your nurse in charge at the beginning, at the end of the shift. It's always good for teamwork. It's good to figure out exactly what the department's like at the beginning, how you're going to work through it. And at the end of the shift, it's always nice for feedback as well. And just to tell people that you appreciate their help, and vice versa. Call your consultant earlier rather than later. I can't stress this enough. If you're thinking that this is a child that might deteriorate, or you're just not sure about how to manage this kind of case, the earlier you call them, the better, both for the child and for the consultant and yourself. Prioritize sick patients early. It's often easy sort of to be handed over a ton of work and to think, right, how am I going to manage all of this? But realistically, the sick child is the one that's the most important. Everything else can wait. And unfortunately, if people have been waiting already for 6.5 hours in A&E to wait to see you, that's just the way that the system works. That's the way that the DGH is set up. People are just going to have to keep waiting. You prioritize your sick patients first, and then you deal with everything else after that. Try and use handovers as learning opportunities. So if you've sent some patients home that you are fairly comfortable with, but you often will never get feedback about those things, try and discuss them with the consultant in the morning after handover or during handover as a teaching opportunity, just so that you can get some feedback on whether you did the right thing. In emergencies, take a breath. You always have a couple of minutes to sort things out, get your team ready. And step up now. This is honestly the best time for you to take the opportunity. I tell the ST3s all the time, would you like to carry the bleep? I did it as an ST3 and it was terrifying, but I was definitely in a much more comfortable place for the beginning of ST4 because I had done it a few times already. Right, finally, rounding off with some of those night shift fears that we talked about. Hopefully they're not so scary now. So the first one was, I'm not going to know what anything is or how anything works. Induction. Ask everything at it. I knew that I was going to be starting on nights, so when we got introduced to the A&E area, I spoke to everyone, figured out how everything worked and where everything was, and introduce yourself to everyone. Once people know that you're the new registrar and a new registrar, they'll try and do their best to try and help you out. What if I can't get the line in? Don't beat yourself up about it. It's really not the end of the world. Ask your colleagues if there's other registrars around. Try and get anaesthetics involved. Remember, there's always IM when it comes to antibiotics, IO if you've got a really sick child, and NG rehydration is always underused, and it's something that we don't think about enough. What if I don't know what the best management is? Use your resources. Think about guidelines, other registrars, ask the nurse in charge, what do we normally do with these kinds of kids? And just do something sensible. If your management is going to impact on consultant decision making in the morning, just try and think about what they're going to be sort of doing. If you're starting child on antibiotics, IV antibiotics, make sure that blood culture is done, things like that, so that they have sort of an endpoint to that patient's care. If there's a resus or a cardiac arrest, take a breath, get your wet flag ready, get your Paediatric Emergencies app out. Don't forget to allocate a scribe. And someone else can call the boss to let them know that that they need to come in or that this is happening, because it's not your job to do that. It's your job to manage the arrest. And what happens if there's more than one emergency? This was a frequent occurrence at Queen's, and it's totally fine. You need to prioritize the sickest patients, split your team appropriately. You can do a lot with a quick A to E assessment. You can do a lot in 5 minutes and then move on to the next patient if these patients obviously aren't in arrest. Call the consultant early if more than one thing's happening at the same time. And if you're split between labour ward and A&E, the A&E team can manage a sick child in A&E. It's your job to really manage that labour ward, that delivery, because you're the one with the skill set to do so. Should I wake the boss up for this? If you're thinking about it, it's time to give them a call. Just be clear about what you want, advice, or for them to come in. And if you're not sure about it and you think it's a bit soft and it's not going to change immediate management and you're admitting the child anyway, then in some cases just do something sensible and it will be fine. But most of the time, just give them the call and they won't worry about it. And that's pretty much it. You know more than you realize. Act confident, and you'll find the confidence, and just be patient. It's one of the biggest steepest learning curves of your career. You're going to make mistakes. It's absolutely fine to make them. It's part of learning and part of becoming a registrar in the first year. Learn from every decision. Reflect on Kaizen. Did more reflections in the first 6 months of being a reg than I think I've done in all 3 years as an SHO. You're going to be fine. Good luck with everything. And if you have any questions, just get in touch. My email's firstname.surname@nhs.net, and I'm happy to help out. Any questions? But we might need to move on.